Hey everybody, welcome to today's Daily Dose of Awesome. Once again, I tried starting a few seconds ago and we got interrupted, so apologize about that. Hopefully it won't happen again. My name is Vitaly Grimlin. I'm your host for today, and this is the Daily Dose of Awesome, brought to you by Elite Marketing Pro, your 15 minutes of motivation, inspiration, and education. And let's see, who do we have on? So I make sure that we are live. Check my other screen here. All right, it looks like we have some people popping on. Great to see you guys. All right, yep, we are definitely live. Cool. Well, I hope we don't get interrupted because you never know with technology. Well, anyways, our topic for today is I want to talk about the most powerful and the most effective way to persuade. And of course, I'm talking about using stories. Now, using stories is not the only way you can communicate with people. It's not the only way you can persuade someone. But in my opinion and in my experience, it is definitely the most effective way to do it. So years ago, when I got started in direct sales, I spent over 10 years selling financial products and services. And it's not an easy product, not an easy service to sell, especially when you're, I was 19 years old when I got started. And so when you're 19, 20, 21, 22 years old in the early 20s, sitting down with people who are twice your age, sometimes even more than that, and talking to them about financial security and talking to them about life insurance and investments and things like that, it's not an easy thing to do. It wasn't hard for me, but it was not easy probably for them to accept what I was saying because I was so young. So I remember I struggled for a long time in that business. I remember one time I had a conversation with somebody that I looked up to. He was doing very well in the company. And he said to me, Vitaly, I'm sure you've heard the statement already, but he said, stories, facts tell, but stories sell. He says, if you want to sell more life insurance, if you want to sell more investments, if you want to have more people say yes to you, then tell stories. He didn't tell me how to do it, but that stuck in my mind. And I started thinking about that, like, how could I use stories to sell what I do or what I had at the time? And I remember that in this business, I used to listen to a lot of, and I still do, but especially early on, I used to listen to a lot of audios, and back then it was audio tapes. So every time I get in my car, I would listen to Zig Ziglar and Jim Rohn and Brian Tracy, as I'm sure most people watching have done the same. Tom Hopkins. I mean, I grew up on this stuff in this business. And so, and actually, no, technically I grew up on it because I was, like I said, I was 19 years old. So imagine from age 19, I was been ingrained with all that stuff. And I remember when he told me about facts tell, but stories sell, I started paying attention, especially to Zig Ziglar. And if you ever listen to Zig Ziglar, you might have noticed, or now that I'm telling you, maybe you'll notice it now, that his entire training, like he had tons of seminars that he's done, but every single one of them was nothing but stories. Like you could listen to a 3-hour seminar on multiple tapes, and it's story after story after story. And let me just check the comments because I am seeing some comments here, but I'm not, for some reason, I'm not seeing the actual comments. Oh, there we go. I got to look here. Hey, Ed, Melinda, Jan, Courtney. Okay, fantastic. Now I'm seeing comments. I don't know why I'm not seeing them here. So anyway, so all of Zig's stuff is stories. Like he would tell story after story after story. And it dawned on me that, he's doing that on purpose because if you give somebody a PowerPoint presentation, or if you tell somebody, listen, attitude is everything, are they really going to remember it? But if you tell them a story, so if you might recall, if you're a fan of Zig Ziglar's, you might recall a story that he told about a little girl who one time saw a bear in the tree. And they called the fire department, and they found out that it wasn't a bear in the tree. It was actually a garbage bag, but it was big and it was black, and it wasn't a bear. And the point, and I'm not doing justice to the story. I mean, he was more entertaining than what I just did here. But the point of the story was that the reason, if you remember, his acronym for fear was false evidence appearing real. And so he says sometimes we're afraid of things that we think are there, but they're really not there. And so that was the point of the story. But if he would have just said that without telling the story, millions of people who've heard that story wouldn't have remembered it. I certainly wouldn't have remembered it all these years later. And so all his entire repertoire was nothing but stories every time he made a point. There was one I remember about the flight being delayed or canceled, and he's stuck in an airport, and he's saying, if a flight's being delayed and everybody's upset, because I think it was Kansas City or somewhere, and everybody's upset and everybody's kind of, groaning and moaning and complaining about the fact that the flight got delayed, and I'm just feeling great because he says if the flight got canceled or delayed, that means that either A, there's something wrong with the pilot, or something wrong with the plane, or something wrong up there. And I vividly remember him saying that. And he said, and in any of those situations, if there's any one of those things that are going on, I'd rather be down here and I'm just happy. And the point of the story was, you got to have a great attitude no matter what happens in life, right? But again, he told it with a story. And so when you break that down, like if you want to study somebody who was the master at it, there are a lot of people that tell great stories. But in my opinion, Zig Ziglar was definitely one of the best, if not the best, storyteller, because his entire teaching was stories. And if you want to persuade somebody, if you want to get your point across, if you want to provide a lesson to somebody, tell a story. So when I started paying attention to that, I asked myself, how can I use that in my own business? How can I use it to sell what I do? So at the time, as I mentioned, I sold life insurance. And what I did is I had a number of stories, but I had one that kind of fell into my lap. It was an unfortunate story, but I used it in my presentation because it made a point very clear. So one of the objections that we get, and actually everybody gets in sales, is I want to think about it. I'm sure if you've ever dealt with somebody face-to-face or over the phone and you ask them to take some kind of action, quite often you get, I want to think about it. And so when it came to my business at the time, when it came time for close, quite often people would say, I want to think about it. Well, a friend of mine had a situation that he took an application for a family, with a family, and they also wanted to think about it. I'm telling you the story as I would tell, or as I used to tell to my prospects. He took an application for a family. He wanted to take an application for life insurance for a family, and the guy wanted to think about it. But he told him, he said, look, while you're thinking about it, it will give me great peace of mind knowing that at least I gave you conditional coverage, because in life insurance, when we take an application and you submit a check with it, you get conditional coverage while it's going through the underwriting process. So he says, look, I can get you covered, and this policy will take about 4 to 6 weeks, maybe 8 weeks to get approved while it's going through underwriting. And then you can take your time and think it over. And if you still don't want it after 8 weeks, that's fine. We can cancel, you get your money back, but at least this time you can think about it and you'll be covered, which makes perfect sense. So he convinced him, he took the application, and sure enough, the guy, about 5 days later, he passed away. And he was young. It was a very unfortunate situation. He was 40 years old, just came home and died of a heart attack. No previous medical history. Now, the point of the story is that the company actually paid out a claim, and he delivered a check for $150,000 to this family. And I know who the family is. There was 2 kids, a wife. They were new to the country, so she didn't hardly speak any English. She was stayed at home. She didn't work. He was the breadwinner. So not only did the family lose the father, which is a huge emotional and devastating situation, right? But also they lost the breadwinner. They lost an income. And it would have been even worse because there was no money. But at least this way, with life insurance, with the conditional coverage that my friend was able to provide for them, he brought a check for $150,000. They were able to move to a different neighborhood, buy a little home and all of that. And so what I would do is I would tell that story in detail, as I told you right now. And what I would do is I wouldn't even wait for people to tell me I want to think it over. I would tell them, listen, our next step is, and I would take out the application, say, we'd fill out this application, and here's what's going to happen. And I would tell them the story, and I would tell them about the conditional coverage, but I wouldn't have to say, look, you're going to get conditional coverage, and here's how it's going to work. I would just tell them the story. And by the time I finished with the story, 8, 9 out of 10 times, unless they were like insane or something, they would say, yeah, let's do it. Because it was an emotional story, and they could relate to it, and they could resonate with it. And so that's what happens when you tell a story. If you do a good job, and if the story is good, if the story is true, especially, as in my case, then these people, they will feel an emotional connection. They will resonate with the story. They will put themselves automatically in the shoes of the person whose story is about. And even though, of course, nobody wants to think about death and all of that, but the reality is that if you have a family, if you have kids, and we're talking about protecting your family, protecting your situation, that's something that everybody wants to do. And there was very little convincing or persuading or arm twisting that I had to do. I didn't have to do any of it. I just told the story. And so when I saw how effective it was, I really realized that it's the only way, well, it's not the only way, but it's the most effective way that you can communicate. Anytime you want to get your point across, anytime you want to provide a lesson, anytime you want to get somebody to see your point and what you're trying to say, the best way to do it is to do it with a story. I did the same thing with investments. I told stories about investments and how mutual funds work. I'm not going to get into that right now because we don't have time, but I also had stories for that as well. And so now let's talk about your business. How could you use that? How could you use stories in your business? So think about your life and what's going on in your life, and maybe something that happened in your life before. In whatever you want to try to get across to your audience, whatever you want to try to get across in your blog posts, in your emails, in your ads, think of a story where you can make a connection. I'll give you one, a really quick one, but let me just take a look at the comments really quick. Jan says, yes, great attitude. Zig was very best. Absolutely. All right, cool. So Courtney says conditional coverage makes sense. Absolutely, it makes sense. And I don't want to get off on a tangent about life insurance, but because I sold life insurance for so long, it absolutely makes sense. And hopefully, just by you listening to this, and if you don't have life insurance, you'll go check out yours today. I don't sell it. I've been out of that business since 2006. But I firmly believe that if you're a provider, if you're a breadwinner, you got to have coverage. And so anyway, so back to marketing and stories in your stories. So I'll tell you a really quick one that I used in an email that just kind of came to me right now. I wanted to make a point in an email about not being afraid and overcoming your fears. And so I remembered when the first time, so one of the most frightening things for most people is public speaking, right? Getting in front of an audience and talking. I'm just going to check comments here really quick from time to time. So I remember the first time that I spoke on a big stage, so to speak. It was about 400 people in the audience, and I had received an award, and they asked me to do a quick 2-minute talk. So I was like one of these 2-minute speakers at a regional event, and I knew that the night before that I had to speak, and so I wrote out my not presentation, but my little talk. It was only 2 minutes. I practiced it, I stayed up late at night thinking about it, like what I'm going to say, how I'm going to say it, because for me to get up and talk in front of a group of people at the time was a very frightening experience. I've never done that before. I've never really spoken to more than maybe 5 or 10 people like that. And so this was the first time that I had to do it. And so I went through the whole thing, and then I went up on stage. And the time came, and I completely forgot everything that I was going to say. And I just said, and I just in my mind, I'm going, well, I'm here, I'm on stage, I have to do this. So I just let it rip and kind of, whatever I guess was in my subconscious mind program from the night before kind of kicked in, and I did it, and everybody stood up and clapped, and I didn't die, I didn't faint. Everything went fine. In fact, from that moment on, I kind of liked it. And, even though every time I got up on stage afterwards, I still had a little bit of butterflies, but it wasn't as scary, and I overcame that fear. And so the point of that story is that, if you do something, you overcome the fear. You do what you fear most, and you overcome the fear. So I remember a while ago, I wrote an email about it, and the subject line was my first time. And then in brackets, in parentheses, I put, it was only 2 minutes. Now, of course, as you can imagine, it's a funny, extremely curiosity-provoking and provocative subject line, which I can't remember the exact open rate, but it had a huge open rate. But that's how I created that little hook, and I told that story. And I remember people were later replying to me saying that, how much they resonated with the story, and it was funny and it was engaging. And so that's a little example, a quick example of how you can use something as ridiculous as getting up on stage and being afraid to deliver a point. And every single one of you have stories that you can tell, whether you want to talk about overcoming fears or having a great attitude or the importance of work ethic or whatever it is that you want to say to your audience, whether it's in an email, in a blog post, in an ad, in a video, in a live video like this, you can come up with a story. So all you have to do is, this is my process. I simply think about the point that I want to make, and then I go back through my memory and remember, what stories do I have that would deliver that point in a more persuasive way than me just telling a point? How can I illustrate it better by telling a story? Again, it can be my story. It could be a story about one of my kids. It could be a story about my dog, something that happened to one of my neighbors, something that happened in school 20 years ago or 25 years ago, or maybe something I saw in the news or read in the book. But just remember this, that anytime you tell a story, immediately people's suspense goes down, their BS detectors go down, they immediately are engaged and listening and tuned into what you have to say, and they're paying attention, and your point will be a lot well and better received than if you were just to say it nakedly without telling the story. And so that's what I want to talk to you about today, guys. Tell stories, get better at telling stories. Go back, listen to your Zig Ziglar audio tapes. If you don't have tape player anymore, then you can download them. The good news is that you can download them through Audible. I found out recently that actually all of Zig's material, or not all of it, but a lot of Zig's material is available on Audible. So listen to those stories and listen how great he delivered them. And not just him. Jim Rohn did it. Brian Tracy did it. Tom Hopkins did it. A lot of these old-timer guys, they were masters of telling stories and teaching lessons that way. So with that, guys, I'm just checking the comments here. Looks like everybody, Curtis says, now that's a hook. That was definitely a hook my first time, if that's what you're referring to. Yes, that's how we come up with hooks, but I'll have to talk about that next time. So with that, guys, I want to thank you for tuning in. Tell stories, and I look forward to seeing you next time. All right, take care, everybody.